Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Meri Herrala to you. She's a Academy of Finland postdoctoral researcher at the
I can say it, University of Helsinki, Faculty of Social Sciences and Political and Economic Studies, and my field is political history.
All right. Yeah, and she's going to be talking about a bit historical topic and across the borders, actually, which is quite appropriate, I think, for our theme. And I'm really happy to have you here. It was a sort of a surprise to me, at least, to learn that you've been working on this kind of a topic, and it's really great to have you here. So please.
Thank you so much, Antti Villi, for inviting me here to the Sibelius-Academy. This is actually now my second time to speak here, so I'm really happy because I haven't had too many opportunities to talk about my former PhD, which I actually have here. And it's published in PhD form by Mellon Press. And it is about the Soviet system of controlling music from 1932 onwards. So I mainly start from some issues or matters written in this book, and then I go towards my nowadays theme about the usage of Soviet elite musicians, classical musicians, as diplomats in the field of soft power competition, cultural competition during the Cold War. So I'm talking about Soviet musical nationalism from Starling to Khrushchev. Yitzhak Brudny, in his monograph Reinventing Russia, Russian Nationalism and the Soviet State 1953-1991, has stated that although Russian nationalism did not become a prominent force in the Soviet society until the mid-1970s, a decade after Khrushchev's fall from power, the period between 1953 and 1964 was crucial to its formation. My expertise as a social scientist and historian covers the Soviet period, especially from the times of Stalin onwards, in particular in the field of Soviet music history. In this speech, I will talk about nationalism in Soviet music from Stalin to Khrushchev. As I will show, in the case of Soviet music, nationalism meant social realism, and this artistic doctrine distanced itself from Western modernist musical tendencies. An antagonism between the East and the West is central to my discussion, but this dichotomy was transformed by cultural exchange between the East and the West. During this period of the new Soviet states, arts were increasingly harnessed as tools of the Soviet Communist Party in order to create a coherent Soviet state. Propaganda and the arts were important media in the process of formation of the multinational Soviet state during its journey from socialism to the expected end state of the Soviet society, communism. During the brief period of the new economic policy from 1921 to 1928, the atmosphere was more free for creative activities. But starting from the 1930s, the Soviet Communist Party and Soviet governmental art organizations started to control creative processes in the arts. The April 1932 resolution on the abolition of proletarian artistic organizations, as well as modernist art organizations, changed the course of the Soviet music for the entire existence of the Soviet Union. The resolution actually was titled The Abolition of Proletarian Artistic Organizations, but there were, of course, also modernist organizations still in the field. The development towards centralized control of Soviet arts happened gradually, depending on the artistic medium. The Soviet Writers' Union was established in 1932, but for example, in Soviet music, the process was slower. The organizational committee for Soviet musicians was established in 1939. It acted as the Composers' Union's governing body until 1948, when the actual Union of Soviet Composers was established to govern nationalism in Soviet music. Thus, from the 1932 onwards, a special system for the creation of socialist art based on the newly formed doctrine and creative method, socialist realism, was established. A set of rules and prohibitions were introduced into the practice of creating socialist art and higher-level socialist culture in comparison to the bourgeois culture of the West. Soviet national culture started to develop systematically according to the rules of socialist realism. New realist music filtered through the nationalist cultural traditions of each Soviet socialist republic. Accordingly, Soviet artistic works were mandated to be national in form and socialism in content. Thus, nationalism in Soviet music can be understood according to this Stalinist slogan. The new directive of socialist realism was initially made public at the First All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934. This is because socialist realism was more easily defined in literary works than musical ones. Thus, literature was an artistic form in which it was easier to embody nationalism in form and socialism in content. Socialist realist content could be more easily monitored and directed in such a musical form as opera. This is because operas could be based on certain acceptable socialist themes. Party control was focused on the process of writing opera librettos, composition process, and the production of an opera for the stage. There were different themes that were more suitable for socialist realist works than the others. For example, the October Revolution, the construction of socialism, class struggle, the Great Patriotic War, socialist heroes in their work, and the formation of a real Soviet man, in Russian Nastoyassy Soviet Человек. In the process of development, Sovietsky Человек, Nastoyassy Sovietsky Человek. And this Nastoyassy Sovietsky Человек was, of course, described in the process of this development from socialism to communism. Especially during the Great Patriotic War, as Soviet propaganda referred to the struggle of Allied forces against their common enemy, Nazi Germany, Soviet nationalism was vigorously boosted in Soviet propaganda. Of course, the Soviet title of the war stresses the Soviet might during the war at the expense of the other winners of the Second World War. What is also decisive for the formation of socialist realism in music is that party in its articles, often published in its mouthpiece Pravda, or certain party resolutions, define socialist realism and Russian nationalism in music by taking such operas as scapegoats that had not fulfilled the qualities of socialist realism. These operas had not fulfilled the demands of nationalism in form and socialism in content, once again. Soviet propaganda was very much appealed to emotions, and any artistic form that was able to express nationalism and patriotism was unscrupulously harnessed by the party. Arts very often described life in the socialist society in such a way as the party required, but sometimes something more private could be depicted below the surface of the nationalistic form and socialistic content. Dmitri Shostakovich's work has often been evaluated by analyzing its internal meanings. But during the first anti-feminist campaign, Pravda condemned Shostakovich's opera Lady Macbeth of Michensk district on January 28, 1936. Its criticism focused on the opera's content, but especially on its music. And I have written much more about this in my book, of course. This article was one in a series of articles published by Pravda during this relatively brief campaign in the arts. Once again, in 1948, party ideologies resorted to an extensive campaign in their quest to strengthen socialist realism as an artistic doctrine. Discussions of socialist realism and its antithesis, formalism, that is, Western musical tendencies in Soviet art, were started after Stalin's furious exit from the performance of his patriot composer Vano Muradeli's opera, The Great Friendship, Velikaya Druzhba. This opera was performed at the Bolshoi Theatre on January 5, 1948. The Central Committee Politburo's resolution on Muradeli's opera followed on February 10, 1948. In this resolution on The Great Friendship, composers belonging to the elite of the Union of Soviet Composers, Dmitri Shostakovich, Sergei Prokofiev, Nikolai Myaskovsky, Aram Khachaturian, Visharion Shebalin, and Gavril Popov were accused of formalism. This accusation meant that they had been creating their artistic works while being under the influence of Western modernism. Composer Dmitri Kabalevsky is rumored to have his name removed from the list. The post-war anti-formalist campaign was often called the Zhdanovshchina because the resolutions published during the 1946 to 1948 had been connected with Stalin's top deputy and apparent heir in the Central Committee, Andrei Alexandrovich Zhdanov. In these ideological resolutions on literary journals, film, drama theaters, and music, that is opera, the current unsatisfactory state in the Soviet arts was discussed through criticism and self-criticism. This was a main ideological offensive to restore control over the arts and ensure adherence to socialist realist principles. Socialist realism would also become a dominant style in other socialist countries. The socialist realist theory drafted by Zhdanov and other party ideologists borrowed intensively from writings of one of the leading Soviet musicologists, Boris Vladimirovich Asafiev. The main theme in Asaf's article, Classical Traditions and the Development of Soviet Arts, Music, is a theory about the existence of two tendencies in Soviet music, a theory that was clearly influenced by the old Marxist-Leninist idea of antagonistic forces. This idea of two tendencies, formalism and socialist realism, can be understood in connection with one of the most important themes in Soviet music, the Asafievan idea of melody and song quality, esennost. This derives from folk sources of the people's melodic art. This is the same as Stalin's theory of nationalistic form. Asafiev's conception of the importance of melodic music is combined with its antithesis, formalism. Formalist composers, instead of cultivating melodious qualities in the vocal parts of their compositions, used recitatives, which meant singing by speaking. According to Zhdanov, formalists trying to be innovative have rejected the classical inheritance. As a result, they had not taken influences from folk music, but had instead composed music for a small group of chosen aesthetics. The three fixed elements of socialist realist art, the trinity of ideinost, ideological content, narodnost, folk appeal, and partinost, party-mindedness, had been already set out by the party leadership in the first All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934. The principle of narodnost meant that artistic works needed to have folk appeal to be understandable to the masses, and thus win popularity among them. This work would make extensive use of folk materials and cite popular themes, even old revolutionary songs, and thus have a real connection to the Soviet people. Narodnost had been a predominant quality in the arts beginning with the introduction of nationalism in Russia and Western Europe in the 1860s and the development of the Russian classical traditions in pre-Soviet times. Thus, socialist realist music had its basis in the tradition of Russian composers, especially the Mighty Five, or the mighty handful, Makushaya Kuchka in Russian. In the 1860s, this circle of composers, including Cesar Sui, Alexander Baradin, Mili Balakirev, Modest Mussorgsky, and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, had striven to create a national school of Russian music free of influences of Italian opera, German lieder, and other Western European forms. I many times have actually difficulties pronouncing Rimsky-Korsakov's name because in Shostakovich's anti-formalist Rayok, it's pronounced Rimsky-Korsakov because Starling or Zdanov actually pronounced it not correctly. So it's somehow haunting me. However, socialist realism also derives from the traditional Western classical composers. For example, Franz Schubert, Robert Schumann, and Ludwig van Beethoven, etc. The representatives of the proletarian music movement had already been drawn inspiration from these composers. The fourth theme, Klassovost or class consciousness, was also associated with socialist realism. Klassovost was manifested at each stage of the development of society. This term embodied the antagonism between Western and Eastern art, the art of different cultures, which was revealed at different stages of development of the Soviet system. There were two kinds of cultures at each stage of the development of socialism: the culture of the predominating repressive class and the culture of the repressed class. The latter was always progressive, and it would be the new ultimate culture of the future. According to socialist realism, art had to serve the three stratums of Soviet society: workers, peasants, and intelligentsia. This culture would achieve victory in communism. The anti-formalist campaign of the 1940s drew increasingly on this idea of antagonism between Western and Eastern art, and of a struggle between two different cultures, the degenerated bourgeois Western culture and progressive proletarian influences. The message of many speeches of this time, especially Stalin's and Zdanov's, was that the world had been divided into two camps, a camp of countries led by the Soviet Union, with its objective of destabilization, imperialism, and establishing democracy. The second camp was the one of the United States and Britain, the so-called imperialist and anti-democratic camp. International tensions in the 1930s and 40s led to the increased need of the Soviet rulers to isolate from the West, turning inwards in order to consolidate their own system by enhancing the cultural and social unity of the Soviet population. The uniting power of the Soviet ideology and culture was effectively used in the socialist nation-building project, especially during the two anti-formalist campaigns. As a campaign of purification against Western tendencies was being pursued, Soviet national identity was being created by encouraging patriotism. That notion was redefined ever more to mean Russian patriotism. The ethnic communities of the Soviet Socialist republics were being driven to participate in Koreanizatsiya, a nation-building project that aimed to unite various national cultures represented by the multi-million Soviet population by creating a mighty Soviet culture based on Russian nationalistic traditions. But this type of Koreanizatsiya process also happened when the Soviet Union constructed and solidified a cultural sphere of influence within its bloc of occupied countries. With its cultural outreach, the process of the establishment of communist regimes, the Soviet-style institutions, customs, and cultural policies in the Central Eastern Europe during the period of 1944-1953, the Soviet Union strove to strengthen Soviet cultural and ideological influences inside its sphere of influence. After the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, or nowadays more like Western Europe, the Soviets took the next step of gradually reaching out to the Western world, or Central Europe, Western Central Europe. This emergence onto a larger stage triggered a period of outreach and cooperation between the USSR and the West. The Cultural Cold War was characterized by a clash of cultures and ideologies. While two competing ideologies, Soviet communist and American capitalist systems, struggled for supremacy and dominance in the world, two competing cultures were also clashing at the same time. It is the conflict of these cultures that gave rise to an alternative method of fighting the Cold War, a method that used Soviet musicians and other representatives of Soviet culture to influence their Western counterparts. The new policies of peaceful coexistence allowed officials in both camps who recognized the need to wage the Cold War on alternative, low-profile battlegrounds to deploy culture as a weapon of soft power in order to achieve their foreign policy goals by attraction rather than coercion. For almost 35 years, the doors of the Soviet Union had remained completely closed. Not until in 1955, when pianist Emil Gilels and violinist David Oistrakh toured the United States, did the back door of cultural diplomacy finally open. First, Soviet musicians were sent to the United States in the atmosphere of Geneva Conference, which provided favorable conditions for Soviet-American cultural interchange. After these, Soviet artists, dance groups, writers, composers, musicians, art exhibitions, and cosmonauts visited the West, showcasing the achievements and artistic products of the great socialist experiment. Soviet performers played an important role in the contents of the hearts and minds of Soviet adversaries or cultural exchange partners, while promoting a picture of the superiority of the Soviet system and culture in the West. Soft power was also a useful means to exchange information about each other's systems and culture by strengthening cultural and ideological influences of the Soviet Union. Soviet transnational encounters are usually characterized by their focus on governmentally controlled operations and the top-down control imposed by these organizations. However, Soviet governmental-level cultural policy organizations also cooperated with non-governmental level organizations in the comprehensive civil society in the West. This is concert firms, impresarios, record companies, for example. In 1955, several American concert firms made offers to the Soviet Foreign Ministry for the organization of the first concert tours of the highest-level Soviet soloists to the United States. Two concert firms achieved victory in this competition for bringing Soviet soloists to the United States: Columbia Artistic Management, headed by Frederick Chang, and Europe Artistic Incorporated, headed by Russian immigrant Solomon Israelovich Gurkov in American Sol Europe. Another option for the cultural exchanges would have been to operate within the framework of the Soviet Union's system of friendship societies. However, the cooperation with the Western concert firms and impresarios, as well as record companies, was preferred because of its significant financial opportunities, and therefore became established as the official means of interaction with the West. Music and dance were often mentioned first in the bilateral cultural exchange agreements signed at the end of the 1950s and beyond, because of their positive influence on the hearts and minds of audiences on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Soviet artists who were sent to foreign concert tours were selected using the criteria of their impact on foreign audiences. Therefore, the Soviets attached their highest hopes on their top performers when sending them overseas. These performers had been tested in the West when they had been sent to international music competitions and won first prizes in them, of course, before the war. The Soviet government's strategic attempt was to show that Soviets were actually better musicians than the Americans. Perhaps this is why they allowed their soloists to perform Western classical repertory, even though Russian classics and new Soviet works were also often performed during the concert tours of Soviet soloists. By utilizing popularized high culture, the Soviets managed to compensate for their inadequacy in their areas of material progress, consumerism, and living standards when compared to the United States. This high prestige of Soviet artists was considered to be a far more efficient method with which to influence foreign audiences than, for example, the modernist tendencies of popular music and jazz. This music, according to the party's official opinion in the Soviet Union, was considered barren, low culture. However, Americans kept sending this type of music to the Soviet Union, and the audience seemed to love it. Because both superpowers realized the importance of transnational cultural contacts in the form of cultural exchanges, a thriving competition developed between the superpowers to determine which of them could send the greatest number of musicians, dancers, artists, etc. to the other, and thus achieve the greatest effect on the public opinion in each other's countries. Bilateral cultural exchange agreements considerably increased the usage of Soviet classical musicians as soft power weapons in the diplomatic field during the cultural Cold War. Such an agreement of cultural, technical, and educational cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States was signed in February 1958. Despite the reciprocal nature of cultural exchanges, the Soviet government used their cultural exchange agreement with the United States more enthusiastically than Americans did. This was noticed in an official report of the Soviet Ministry of Culture to the Central Committee regarding the exchange of soloists between these countries during the period of 1955-1972. According to this report, the number of Soviet classical music soloists dispatched to the United States outnumbered the quantity of American soloists sent to the Soviet Union, obviously. Americans compensated for their lack of classical music soloists sent to the Soviet Union in some years by sending larger symphonical orchestras or companies to the Soviet Union. Thus, a cultural arms race developed, but unlike the military escalation, the goal of this arms race was to establish better relations and enhance the mutual admiration of the adversaries. However, it's interesting that one of the Soviet reports indicates that the United States State Department, in the discussions on agreements, demanded that the exchange of artists to be diminished. According to the Soviets, Americans were afraid of the popularity of Soviet art among their people, which could lead to the Soviet Union becoming respected by Americans. It was also stated in the Soviet report that the United States actively hampered the development of cultural relations with the Soviet citizens for a long time. The fingerprinting of Soviet artists and artistic collectives traveling to the country was one of the measures used to inhibit cultural relations. Between 1955 and 1973, more than 2,000 Soviet artists, dancers, and artistic groups toured the United States. The extent to which Soviet performers were sent to the West and the number of the concert overseas suggests the importance of their professionalism to the Soviet Union in its ideological struggle. The concert tours of Soviet musicians to the United States provided the most noticeable means for achieving the goals of the Soviet government to strengthen the cultural and ideological influence of the Soviet Union, advertise its successes, and promote a picture of Soviet superiority in the eyes of the United States. Music, with its soft power, certainly had an impact on the relations between the superpowers, and at the same time its high level and significant influence on the audience boosted Soviet nationalism and patriotism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Meri. Now we have some 15 minutes for discussion. Go for. Really?
One of the categories of civil society is the fact that all the decrees and including the socialist realism and others, that there were discrepancies between what was said from above and then between the real life. So what was really happening in whatever life, in everyday life and musical life. So for instance, the decree about socialist realism, but what do you think did it really realize in society? So what was the impact from the law?
Yeah, of course it was realized, but
What's the extent of it?
yeah, unfortunately, as a historian, I have been, and of course, many people, when I'm researching this new theme, it's actually more possible to actually interview some of the people who knew these actors in the Soviet cultural scene. And what I have been studying in the former Soviet archives from the documents of the 1930s and 40s, they are basically formed according to this system which was seen and which was formed during the 1930s and 40s during the Stalin period. So the system was basically outside discussions of critical tune and self-critical tune. It was when party or Prague took up these articles or resolutions. They were always critical. By criticism and self-criticism, the system of Soviet music, the creation was supposed to be developed. So of course, inside your circles, you would do whatever, and of course there are, for example, Shostakovich's anti-performance Rayok, which reacted to this 1948 campaign, was reacting to this party rule. So basically, but that was kept under the private circle and performed there. So on the surface, you could have these meetings and discussing, but in general, political discussion, you needed to perform this criticism, self-criticism, and we were talking.
So as my own research indicated, like all those policies, they did not have very much impact on the real musicians' everyday life. For instance, in my study in jazz music, the musician anyway, although the people said that it was forbidden, but the music was played anyway, even during the fascist Stalin did not disappear anywhere. But whatever was the policy.
It seems that in Estonia it's really easier to find this kind of documents. But my quest when I was writing my PhD was especially to research this governmental and political level control So therefore, in my book, this level and these discussions have been. And from Soviet archives, we need to. There are so many discussions, so we need to really look at what is it? 95 last to find this one.
So, I think it's a very interesting example also, how culture is controlled or personal power. And as you were talking, I was also thinking, it's also interesting how the very concept of culture is also quite complex in the sense that it's also quite ambivalent. On the one hand, it's used almost as a synonym to high art, or culture is, what is culture as art, whereas the anthropological concept of culture is something which is always, in change. So this ambivalence, leads me to this question also, is it really possible to control culture? It relates a little bit to the question of reality and those borders over enforced, I guess.
Yeah, therefore, my book actually showed that this system was it was just developing through this criticism and self-criticism, and it wasn't actually going to anywhere because it was so hard to form, or hard to say what is socialist realism in general. And of course, in this speech, I did not take any examples of these operas I was analyzing, and there were all sorts of attempts to also give their own creative process and not to only cite nationalistic melodies in these operas, but many times so-called a little bit bad Soviet operas were composed because they tried to be socialist realism, which was not actually really defined. So I don't know if I answered your question.
I think that is an important, important aspect of this, that the reference, in reference to Hans's emphasis there in the presentation about language that circles and how these ideas of national identity that they great extent are based on language use. And you were mentioning that especially the way, I can't remember the exact wording there, but especially that music and dance were regarded as useful ways to disseminate these ideas, and the way in which those are really kind of forms of expression that go beyond or invade the language as such, or that they need to be to translate them is a different matter than translate language or conceptualize in linguistic terms. So it's easy, and that also brings to one of the quotes that I had in the opening address about this malleability of music that can be used for various purposes very easily, and it's a good example. I was just wondering, there's also I listed some prefixes to the word nationalism or national there, and you added actually one to that list. No, I mean in English you use the word multinational Soviet state, and I was just wondering there that what would be the implications of this system of conceptualization as opposed to, for example, multi-ethnic, and in terms of then the national music, what constitutes national music as opposed to ethnic music or so forth. What are the implications of this multinationalism or national condition of Soviet state?
I think that they actually meant the same, but I just used that term. And it was the thing was that composers from the center, from Moscow and St. Petersburg, were oftentimes sent to national socialist republics. Among the composers there, to sort of tell them to compose socialist realism, but from the perspective and from their own traditions, ethnic traditions. And of course also so-called Russian composers, they collected folk songs of these ethnical nationalities, nations, and they were using them also in their own musical works, and national theaters and national operas were created during these times. So this multi-ethnic community was kept alive